You're listening to Gospel of Peace, a podcast for kingdom women and everyone else about political theology and everyday faith. Today, Matt and I will be hosting, and we have a special guest today. So let's jump right into Matt. Do you want to start out with the first question?
Let's do it. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah.
It's good to have you here. I'm excited about this conversation. I wanted to say right off the bat that this conversation could be a little intense, but I think really important. And so we're grateful. We're grateful that you're here. In any space, whether it's, the work that I'm doing with clients or on a podcast like this, I always want to make sure that people know that we work and do our best, Rebecca and I, to make sure it's a safe place to talk about these things. And so we honor your story and all the things you've been through, and know that there is pain and beauty that we're diving into today. So thanks for being willing to come in and be with us today.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
really honored. So thank you for having me.
yeah, yeah, awesome. So Anne, let's do the question of who are you? So just a little bit about where you're from. Kind of maybe where you grew up, stuff like that. What kind of community? So really just a little bit about you, whether it's, and you're, feel free to share whatever, and then
Okay.
we'll jump into your story.
All right, awesome. So um, I'm Anne. I was born a Peachey. I am the oldest of 9. I grew up in Big Valley, so kind of central PA. It's a pretty big Mennonite Amish community right there. It's unique in that there's 3 colors of buggies, which is kind of makes it a very unique place. We have white, black, and yellow. And so it's a very unique place. There's a lot of different Mennonite and Amish churches there, but I grew up in one that was unaffiliated. I would say it's kind of a cross between like the Hope Fellowship churches and Mid-Atlantic. I would say is kind of the space where I would have grown up in. My dad was a deacon from the time I was 1, and I'm the oldest of 9. So that's all I know. I don't know any different. I was always a preacher's kid. I like to say that I was in. Sometimes my Amazon coworkers are like, were you really actually Mennonite? And I'm like, I was in. I was a preacher's kid. So yeah, I feel like my family was kind of at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. And people looked up to our family. I think I'm just now realizing how much of that went on. We were kind of I don't know, I feel like we were at the top in some ways. And that feels really weird now looking back, to say that. But the other thing that was kind of different, we lived, like I said, we lived along the main drag in the valley. So it was kind of like living in a glass house. And people tell me all the time they would drive by and everything looked great. Like, I like to say that everything looked peachy, pun intended, but like, it was just, everything looked really good. Our family recorded a singing CD when I was 11, and I recorded a piano CD when I was 14. So there was a lot of music involved in my life growing up. I truly appreciate the role that music played in my growing up, especially due to trauma. Like, that was my out. So that was really cool. My dad grew up Amish, so he valued education pretty highly. So I grew up on all the CLE books, all of the CM books. That's kind of the literature that I got fed. We didn't do a lot of rod and staff. It was mostly CLE and CLP and CM. So that's kind of the general idea. I feel like we didn't really hang out with a lot of other churches a lot because we were unaffiliated. Like, I feel like they do that more now than what they did when I was growing up. So either way, though, the community is definitely very insular.
I heard from someone that this is the Belleville area, right?
Yes.
That out of all the different Mennonite communities or Amish communities, the housekeeping standards are the highest. Like, not just outside, because Holmes County, it's all
Wow,
about
really?
your grass and your lawn looking perfect. It's the inside too. So it's like, and maybe part of that comes from being an insular community. I don't know, but that's the impression other people have.
It's very much that way. Like, Saturdays were the day you get everything spick and span and completely ready, like down to your vehicles, your lawn, the inside of your house. Like there was a lot of pressure to perform.
Okay. Wow. A couple things jumped out at me. One was yellow buggies. That's a thing, eh? We don't have those up here. Is that a
Yeah,
particular
that's very
kind of
different.
Amish?
Yeah, that's my dad actually grew up in the yellow buggy church. So
Yeah.
they're bright yellow too. They're not
I
like
was
a,
gonna say, are we talking like the sun? Like we're talking
yeah,
yellow?
like we're talking like bright yellow.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. I've yet to see that. So can put that on my bucket list.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, you know, it's another thing that stuck out to me that you were talking about was this idea of being at the top with, you know, being in, just really quickly, I'm curious, was that because of your dad's position in leadership? Was that because of your family's status? Where did that come from? That feeling?
I would say it was mostly because of being a church leader.
Hmm.
That's where that would come from. Some churches, it feels like, the preacher's kids can get away with anything. But for
Hmm.
us, it was like, well, you're a preacher's kid. You gotta walk the line and be perfect. So that's kind of how it was very much that way. Um, and the other thing too is the leadership at the church that grew up in, it was primarily controlled by one family.
Mm.
So I see that as very problematic and concerning now. But yes, my mom's family was the primary, I would say, controlling feature in the church. Super, super problematic. Don't even get me started, but that's how it was. So
Yeah.
when I say it was on the top, I really do kind of feel like that, kind of feel like I was at the top.
I have lived experience with that as a preacher's kid. So there's that the both and, right? The tension of you are at the top and you're in a glass house. And so
Yeah,
you hold this kind of and it was the same for our family that we were not the ones getting away with everything. We were walking the line and making sure that we were kind of an example, even though that all fell apart. But yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. There's this kind of you have a particular level of power and you're held to a high standard that creates a lot of tension and
yeah,
I'm sure that's,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's
And
interesting.
I was the oldest of 9, so it's like I kind of got a lot of
Yes. Yes.
it.
That adds to it for sure. That oldest, also the oldest. So this is not story matching, but that is interesting. Yeah, very good. So that's you. So and then just before we jump into your story, Anne, what about now? Like just can you just tell me and a little bit about where you're at now? What
Okay,
you're up to
so
these days?
okay, so well, I feel like I kind of went from the top to the bottom in some ways.
Mm,
And don't regret that fall at all. Don't regret being at the bottom of the ladder. I feel like in some ways I feel like my relationship with God looks a lot different than what it used to. There's not this pressure to perform like there used to be. And so yeah, I think I'm gonna talk some about leaving, but
mhm.
I'm not right now. I don't go to any church because stepping inside a church is really hard. And I think after I tell my story, you'll understand why. But um, yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I'm not saying I'll never set foot inside a church again. I'm just saying right now is not a good time for me to do that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and I kind of feel like there's a verse that talks about the burning flax. God does not step out or like stomp out the burning flax. I kind of feel like a burning flax right now. Like
Mm.
God's not stomping me out. My light's not out, but like I'm just resting. I'm taking a break. I'm trying to
Mhm.
heal. So
I love that. I love that. And that's a really nice segue to think about like what are we healing from? And that's the story, right? I think that's what we are going to talk about today. So I want to give you the space for that to talk about. And you and I've talked off camera about some of the stuff, so I know a little bit about it. And Rebecca, I know you do too. But that's part of the reason we're doing this today is to give light to your story. And so we'd love to hear it, to just talk anything you feel comfortable with. Of course, it's like I said at the beginning, it's your story. So just tell us a little bit about why you're outside of the church today, why you're the burning flax.
Okay. All right. So first of all, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to do this because I've wanted to do it for a while, but it just never really came together. And so I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to do this. But for me, the biggest thing that overshadows everything in my life, I would say, like the biggest thing that stands out every time somebody asks me, like, what's the biggest thing that happened to you? And it's hands down the rape that happened when I was 7 years old. For me, it was a grown man in his late 20s, early 30s, and a couple of 18, 19-year-old boys, men. I'm going to say men because they're men. And they basically, the older guy was showing the younger guys how to do it, how to rape a woman and a girl. I wasn't even a woman, but they, it was very traumatic for me as a 7-year-old. That's like, shouldn't even have to be said, but I'm not really sure how much to go into with that. I think the biggest thing for me is that they said it was love. So in my mind, my brain is already connecting love with something that's hurtful, painful, traumatic. And it really, really messed up my psyche as a child. I think that for me, there's a part of me that, I was little, I was innocent. I mean, you look at a 7-year-old girl, I look at a 7-year-old girl and I'm just like, how in the world did I survive that? I don't know how. I literally don't know how I survived because they took every last shred of dignity that I had and innocence. And I tried getting away and it just got worse. The more I fought, the more it got worse. And so I felt like my body gave up. I felt like my body betrayed me because, so one thing we don't talk about much is that there is a piece of arousal whenever there's any kind of sexual stimulation, even if it's in the context of abuse and rape. And so for me, it was super confusing as a 7-year-old because I didn't know what was happening to me. I didn't understand. I didn't know what they wanted. And my brain in those moments were just going, I just need to do whatever they say so I get through this, so I live. If I don't make them mad, then it won't get worse. So that's when I quit fighting. They mocked and laughed at me. They told me that I was their girl. This is what I was made for. And I believed it. I mean, kids believe what adults tell them, even whenever it's somebody that's not safe. And so I felt like I was completely alone in the hands of evil. And I remember like praying or crying out saying, help me, Jesus, help me. That was my mantra. I kept saying that over and over again. I don't know if I said it out loud, if I said it in my brain, I don't know for sure. But that was like the thing that kept on like ringing in my head. And it was very, like I said, it was very traumatic for me. There was terror, there was confusion, pain, and then also, worst of all, that sexual stimulation that I talked about earlier. And so very traumatic, very like when I say it messed with my psyche, I feel like I am definitely still dealing with the effects from that day. And I learned things that day, and I have a list of stuff I learned. So I learned that love is giving someone what they want without asking why or resisting them. I learned that love is being used for someone's personal pleasure. I learned that love is painful, that love uses and then discards. I learned that love is submissive to another in every way. I learned that love is the feeling I have when someone is stronger than me and is in control of me and my body. I learned that love is using my body to exert control over someone else. I learned that love tells me to stuff my emotions and not cry. to be brave and not let anyone feel what I really feel. And so this thing that happened at 7 years old, just like for the next several years after that, I did not remember anything of my childhood. I really stuffed it in. And I think that that's partly why my parents took the path they took and are taking today, because when you don't understand that trauma can sometimes get like, our brains, in order to survive, they suppress trauma. They suppress those memories. And so if you'd asked me as a 10-year-old girl if I was abused or raped, I would have said no, because my brain just did not go there at that point. It was only until I actually moved away from Big Valleys whenever things started like coming out and I started remembering things. So that is very common from what I understand. Like for people that have gone through that kind of thing, that's very common for people just to like shut down and completely not remember anything for a while. And then it raises its head whenever you're in a space where you're actually safe and when you're actually able to like bring it up and work with it and deal with it. So I am just grateful. I'm grateful that it happened, that stuff came back up as a young adult and not like as a 40-year-old woman. Like I'm so grateful it came up when I was 21 and not 40, because that would have been 20 more years of, you know, just dealing of being in that state where you're stuck. And I'm grateful that it came out when it did. So yeah.
Quick question, like, so
Sure.
did this occur in the context of your own church community? Were these adults from your church?
So they all worked for my dad. My dad has a business, and they all worked for him. And so it happened at my own place, because my dad's business is based at the home place. And so, yeah, it was, and they were all Mennonite men. So they were not Amish, and they were not, you know, people that don't go to church anywhere or something like that. They were all Mennonite men. So.
Thanks for, I mean, as you kind of think through that story, that's deeply painful. You talked about the path that your parents took. I don't want to jump ahead of where you were going with your story, but I mean, it clicked for me in terms of that. Do you want to speak to that? Like just in terms of initial and
I might wait.
sure, of
But
course.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I'll let you go where you were.
yeah, so after the rape, like I said, I shut down completely. I don't remember much between like first grade and fifth grade. There's a couple of years there where I literally do not remember much of anything. Even just like I'll see pictures and I can remember like where I was. But if there was no pictures, I'm not sure I'd remember much at all. I tried really hard to be good. I subconsciously realized that if I can keep people from being angry at me, then bad things don't happen. And so, oh, but goodness, I tried so hard to be good. I tried very hard. And my relationship with God was a really rocky one because of that, because I was always trying to perform in order to be loved. And I was always afraid God was going to hit me if I messed up. I had a very, very irrational fear of thunderstorms because of that, because I thought that God was going to just like, you know, lightning was going to come out of the sky and strike me. My fear of God led me to become a Christian at age 9. And I think it was genuine, but I feel like I did it out of fear. Like I became a Christian out of fear of hell, out of fear of God, and not the good kind of fear of God, the very terrorizing fear of God. The preachers thought I was too young to be baptized, so I had to wait till I was 12. But like I said, my relationship with God was super rocky because of just for me, it was all about performing for this God that was going to hit me if I messed up. I mean, I think a lot of Mennonite kids can relate to that. I think a lot of us have that in us. And I think I know why, but we'll get there. So, puberty was a really, really rough time for me as a Mennonite girl. Beauty is evil in the Mennonite culture to a degree. Kind of. There's kind of a two-edged sword to it, because it feels like there's this like, guys want beautiful women. They want to get married to beautiful women, but then it's also this two-edged sword, like beauty's bad, so you have to cover everything up. So for me as a Mennonite girl, it was really hellish. I was always told that ankles and elbows make men lust, and so I was always freaked out that I was going to make men lust. And so when I would go to a thrift store, whatever, to buy sweaters, it was always this question of, is this too form-fitting? Is this going to make men lust? Like, I can't even tell you the amount of brain power every day that I took into being modest to keep men from lusting. And again, in the context of the 7-year-old of the rape at 7, that was even more. For me, it was a way to try to make myself safe. I feel like the modesty that I was taught was all about keeping me safe. And it was a way for me to try to control what happened to me. I don't think I'm alone in that, but I think that people don't want to admit that the modesty that's often like talked about in those cultures is really simply a way for women to try to keep themselves safe. It's all they know. It's all they know. We had to wear black hose to school. And I could never figure out why, because to me, it's like full length hose makes your legs look real good. So like, why in the world are we wearing this, right? But then, skin tone was like bad. So it was really confusing. And it felt like there were double standards everywhere. Like, you couldn't have too long of a dress, because if you had to pull it up, then it was sensual. Like, it was just this whole list of unspoken and spoken rules that made me feel like I wasn't beautiful, and that I wasn't, like, my self-image was seriously lacking. Self-image was really bad during that time. The other thing is, I feel like in that culture, if you do everything right, wear a covering, cape dress, bad things won't happen to you. Like, that's the messaging I received. And so even though it wasn't explicitly said like that, it's in subtle ways. In subtle ways, it's taught like that. Even like CLP's book about head coverings, that's called Neatly Covered, Divinely Protected. Like, that entire title is this, again, selling the idea that if you cover your head, God will protect you. And so as a young adult, as a young girl, this was like really confusing for me, to be honest, because I wanted to be modest. I wanted to not make men lust, but there was just all this stuff and to do that I had to do. And then deep down inside, obviously, there's this subconscious knowing that it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what I do. If they want something from me, they're going to get it anyway. So it's a very confusing time of life for me. So that's kind of my teen years and my growing up, kind of how it all went. I would say that's a very brief overview, but.
So there's a book I talk about at the recent abuse symposium, which is the Pathway Publishers book, To a Girl of 11. And it literally says, this is to an 11-year-old, that, you have to be really careful to stop your own brother from being tempted by your body, and then it's your fault that you awakened desires that he can't control, and he's innocent. They literally use the word innocently coming upon you, and then that the passage is talking about sexual abuse. But so I'm just thinking about the messaging that you had, and I'm wondering like where that would have come from. Would it have been unsaid? Would it have been in books like the CLP book or sermons? What would be some places where you would have picked up on this messaging?
There was definitely in books and in messages, but I think it was just in the way how modesty was explained to me even. So I know girls from my culture who grew up in the exact same church that I grew up in, and they did not receive the messaging about modesty that I did. So I kind of feel, or they didn't have it nearly as much as what I did. So I kind of feel like it might have been how my mom explained it, how and again, that would go through it with my mom's story, which I can't share someone else's story, but I feel like it came from more so how I was taught about it versus like a church thing. Although I think there was rumblings of that over the pulpit, but I know that there are some people in my church who grew up in the same church as me, same school, who did not get all that hellish messaging that I did.
And when you say cause men to lust, does the word lust connect to acts of sexual violence that like cause men to lust, so you have to dress modestly to prevent lust? And is that sort of part of that, like the assault and the violence and like things, violent things that can happen to you? And so modesty is supposed to be sort of a way to prevent that or protect yourself? Is that where, like, when you use the word lust, does it mean the action as well, or just simply thoughts?
No, action as well. Like I definitely feel like in their minds, if you did everything right, then you wouldn't be raped. Like if you dressed completely right, men wouldn't want to rape you because you're modest. Again, it was the whole, it's weird because it's like this health and wealth gospel kind of thing, but it's like a twist with the modesty thing. It's super, super confusing, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Period. Point blank. It does not work.
It's a way to maintain culpability of the victim. It's because you can always find something wrong about the victim that makes it their fault. That's rape culture.
Yes, it really is. It really is. It's literally rape culture. And it's hard for it used to be hard for me to say that out loud, but it absolutely is rape culture.
Doug Wilson is low-hanging fruit because, it's
Yeah,
Doug Wilson. But he, like, just last night, my wife's reading a memoir right now, Rift, I think by Caitlin or Kate something. I'm uncertain, someone who grew up in that context. And she just read a quote by Douglas Wilson, which is exactly what both of you are talking about. This idea that if a woman steps outside of, I don't know it word for word, but it's essentially outside of that umbrella, right? Out of the pastor and the husband, what they've laid out as the safe space, then she is asking, and it's his words, to like, she's literally asking for sexual assault because she stepped outside of that protection. And so speaks to what you were saying, Rebecca, speaks to your story, Anne, of like, if you, wear the things we tell you to wear, if you, keep your eyes down or whatever, then you can protect yourself from crazy men. And as a guy who grew up in a context like that, that was kind of the messaging we got. It was kind of like, you're dangerous. So like, know this about you. You have like serious problems, but it is what it is. And so the best you can do is bounce your eyes and hope to heck that you don't meet an immodest woman, because you're wired this way. And so that's not like for you guys, like saying, hey, like this is the messaging you got. It's absolutely what the guys were getting, was the opposite of that. Was that, you are a conqueror. You are like to go out there and take things. And it's like it's up to the women to dress modest because gosh, what do you do if you're on the beach? Like we don't know what to do. This is too bad for us now because we're animals. So it's horrible. But that's the
Well,
message.
and it demoral. I mean, it's dehumanizing to both men and women. That's the thing that's so frustrating. Like I feel like the guys, yeah, like you said, the guys got a whole dose of that too, just in a different way. And it's super sad because I feel like when you tell people that they are like that, when you tell guys a whole bunch of boys that this is who they are, they can't help themselves, well then you're setting them up to become that. And it's really insane because it doesn't matter what women do. Lust does not come from, what's outside of somebody. And that has been like a huge thing for me to understand and get and believe because yeah, it really helps me to it takes the pressure off of me as a woman and helps me love my body, love who God made me, and in a way that I can't do that. I couldn't do that in that culture because of it.
Well said.
So, is it okay if I go into some of the silencing stuff?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll go into the church silencing thing first, and then I'll go into like parental, family silencing. So I began blogging about sexual abuse in 2016, and I did it because I realized that like there were a lot of people like me, a lot of women like me, who had never talked about what happened to them, and I felt very alone at that point. And so I was like, you know what? Maybe I just need to start talking about it. Like, it's not going to get any better by just being quiet. And so I started blogging. And at that point in time, there were not a lot of people talking about abuse. I was one of the few voices at the time. And the more I opened up about what happened to me, women came out of the woodwork everywhere. And I didn't know. It was weird because I never went into it thinking it was going to be a big deal. I didn't know that, there was so much of it out there. I didn't know. And at first, my posts seemed to be really well received from people in my church. We had moved away and I wasn't in Big Valley anymore. And so the church we were in, I felt like was a pretty open to that sort of thing. And I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think that there'd be a problem with it. Again, at first my posts seemed to be well received. But as time went on, I began realizing that some of our theology was playing into the epidemic of abuse. And specifically things like forgiveness, the fixation on forgiveness, and also the thing of modesty being a protection for women. And so when I began voicing my concern with how these topics were being presented, I was met with resistance. And people started feeling like I'm bashing the church, essentially, is what I was told. I was told repeatedly by many different people that I should just be a wife and a mom and not blog about abuse anymore. And for me, blogging at that point was kind of my out. Like it was kind of a way for me to, it was a good way for me to process what was going on in me. And then it gave me a why. It gave me a way to bless other people. And so I kept on doing it, even though I was met with resistance. Ben was like, keep writing, it's all right. But I had a lot of people that would step inside my house and be like, you need to work on your house and not write. So there was a lot of that went on. The concern was mostly in relation to my calling as a wife and mom. I say calling in quotations because, again, supposedly it really feels like to me in this culture, in the Mennonite culture, if a woman is anything other than a wife and a mom, she's not doing it right. Like, my entire identity was supposed to be in being a wife and popping out babies. Like, that's what it felt like to me. And so there was a lot of that. A lot of the pushback was about being a wife and a mom. And like, my house is not great. Like, I know I come from Belleville, but that it's not something that comes naturally for me. The organization, the housework part, it's not something that's easy for me to do. So I often struggle with that even as a teenager. So having people say that about my house, it was just kind of, yeah, well, that's me. Like, take it or leave it. Also very interesting because some of the people that really pushed back were people that had side hustles, were women that had side hustles with multi-level marketing companies or things like a sewing company and that kind of stuff. And I felt very ganged up on. I found out later that there was a lot of ganging up on me. There was a couple of women who would tell one of my friends to tell me to stop writing. So a lot of the stuff came from a group of women, particularly, and it was very confusing for me because I didn't realize at the time how much gaslighting was going on. I didn't realize what all was happening, and I was just a very confused person. I didn't understand why they didn't want me to write. I knew what I was supposed to do. It was a lot at one time. Those years were hell, and I don't want to ever go back. So probably the greatest moment of silencing, though, came in 2019 when the CM Haiti scandal broke. 2 weeks after that all blew up, one of the preachers here at Cornerstone preached a sermon on grace. And in it, he quoted from news articles about abuse in the Mennonite culture, specifically about Trudy, although he did not mention her name. And he talked about Trudy was talking about how that forgiveness is being used to cover up abuse. And he said over the pulpit in a very loud voice, he said, "I am proud we are a people of forgiveness." And that is the moment that I knew that we were no longer safe in the Mennonite church. I still go back to that day, and I still have a lot of trauma surrounding that day for me. Testimony time came up, and it got really interesting because there were people that did not usually give testimony that stood up and was like, "That was such a good sermon." And then my husband stands up and he says that the 10 Commandments talks about carrying the name of the Lord in vain. And he said, this thing of focusing on grace whenever we've carried the name of the Lord in vain is disgusting and gross. It's basically the general thing, what he said. And then he sat down and we had a one song at the end. And during the song, I remember feeling like there were just great sobs that were coming up and choking me in my throat. And Ben looked at me and he said, "Do you want to go home?" And I said, "Yes." And we walked out. And as soon as we were out of the building, I started weeping. And I've never wept so hard in my life. I cried for the next 6 hours. It felt like my feet had just been knocked out from under me because I truly believed that this church was safe, and all of a sudden it's not. And we almost didn't go back after that, but we decided to try to make it work. So for the next 3 years, we went to church, did our thing. We tried to make it work. It didn't work. We did go to the pastor later on, sat down with him. We tried to like understand where he was coming from. We tried to help him understand where we were coming from. It was, in my opinion, not a super great meeting. I felt like people who knew our story by that point and knew him felt like we were taking it too hard. They thought that, you know, since he had a stroke, he doesn't always communicate things as well. So it was us that took it wrong. And it was even said things like, well, you know, because you've been abused, therefore, like, you know, these sorts of topics are more triggering to you. And so that's why you took it wrong. Like, it was always about our response to it, not about what was actually said. There was also a couple of times where my husband was told to keep his wife off of Facebook. And so there was things like that. So we were both getting it. It was Ben getting it, me getting it. After a while, it was pretty clear to people that Ben stood behind everything I wrote. And so then at that point, he was basically, he began experiencing church very differently. People didn't talk to him after church. He was not put in any kind of committees, nothing. So for the last like 3 years, he was on the graveyard committee, which I'm sorry, that doesn't really count. But you know what I mean? Like, he wasn't asked to do things. He wasn't asked to be a part of stuff. It was very low key. I know that, like, I say that we left, but it feels to me like we got pushed out. That's what it feels like. It feels like we weren't wanted there anymore. And so eventually we left, which I think I get into that a little more later here. So that's kind of the extent of some of the church silencing that happened. Again, it had to do with me not writing because I need to be a wife and a mom. And then also just the sermon thing that happened, being told that Ben needs to keep his wife off of Facebook. There was just a lot of that went on, and it was very much gaslighting.
It's interesting to hear the very typical responses to the subject of abuse making people uncomfortable, because in the wake of the crisis, it's like there were children in orphanages being harmed that literally have nothing. And yet, despite these dozens of boys, the most important thing right now is to feel good about the culture and forgiveness. And it's so overt, but it also it's like showing like that desperation to maintain a very like an exalted righteous view of yourself and your culture. It's quite like very, very obvious and stark, but somehow I guess in that culture it sounds like you were like that was the facade they were also intent on maintaining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I was thinking there's something else I had here. Oh, okay, so I'm just gonna say this too. There were times I felt supported by church people. So I wanna, like, not everybody did this thing of silencing. And what also makes it hard is some people did silencing and also supported me at some point. So like there's some of that too, where it's mixed bag, you know, for me. So one of the pastors went with us to meet with the investigators on my case when I reported my abuse. And I 100% appreciated that, still do appreciate that. There were church ladies who allowed me to cry in their arms, even when I said I didn't need them. Specific incidences that I can think of where people left me cry in their arms. They would sit out church services with me when church services became too hard for me to sit through. I would leave and one of them would see me leave and they would follow me and they would just sit there with me while I cried. There were people who went out of their way to let me know that they cared. And I am super, super grateful for every one of those people that did that. I truly believe that with the spiritual abuse that we experienced there, it was not perpetrated purposely. Rather, it was perpetrated out of ignorance, out of a messed up theology, and also, this is the biggest one, an idolization of the Anabaptist culture. That, in and of itself, is the absolute biggest one. You know, there were people who did randomly encourage us to keep writing. But I think what I want people to hear is that when you have one or two people who really, really badly want you to stop writing, and it comes from people at the top, when it comes from leadership, and everybody loves that leader, right? Everybody likes that person. It can make you feel really, really alone and like you're being ganged up on, even though not everybody is saying that. So the quiet encouragement doesn't, from like the back end of side of things, like when someone comes to you and says, you know, I want you to keep writing. Thank you for writing this. But they don't say it publicly. They're not willing to like put skin in the game. That's the part that hurts. Because there were people saying quietly, we like what you're writing. But when it came to push and shove, and they would have had opportunity to say publicly that, you know, we appreciate what Anna's writing or whatever. They never said that. And so it just felt like it was me against the world sometimes. It was us against the world. I felt very ganged up on. So I think the biggest thing that I want people to understand is when you see someone who's being silenced for doing the right thing, it's not enough to just pat them on the back in private. You have to stand with them publicly, no matter the cost. Otherwise, they're going to eventually leave. And so, yeah, that's my little snippet of encouragement to people who are still in the culture.
It's a risk that they stand because they might be pushed out and isolated and misrepresented too.
Yes. Yep. And then I'll talk about kind of family silencing, and kind of how that all went down, because we had talked about that earlier. My parents say they believe my story. But they have yet to meet that belief with action. And one of the men who raped me is still deeply involved with my dad's business to this day. And we would go home for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, and this guy would randomly show up. And I began having a lot of flashbacks whenever we would go back. And it got to the point where it would take me a couple weeks afterward to really recover from that. And so in December of 2020, we decided to have a sit down with my family, with my parents specifically. And I explained that Christmas at their house was just, it looked too big. It looked too daunting for me. I was at a really bad point then mentally. And I did not want to come home and have all these flashbacks. I explained to them that their choice to walk the middle of the road, which is literally what they said, was hurting me. I needed them to either make a choice between either him or me. Like, I didn't want to be this in the middle of the road thing. My dad really pushed back on this. He didn't think it was fair to make him make a choice like this. So we ended up putting a boundary in place. We told them that we would not be back to the home place until the man who raped me would not be around anymore. We've kept our deal. It's been 4 years. One of the reasons we had this conversation with them then was due to the fact that my brother was dating, and I knew that if he would get married, this guy would be invited too to the wedding. And so I didn't want it to blow up over the wedding. So that's why we had this conversation. But the problem is that when my brother's wedding invitation came, Ben did text my dad saying, you know, is he invited? And my dad texted back and was like, can we have a phone call? And that phone call is nothing short of abusive. I'm really glad I wrote everything down because it was super traumatic. Almost immediately, my dad asked the question, did Jesus ever, at anyone's request, tell someone that they couldn't be in the crowd? And my response was, that is an irrelevant question, because we know what Jesus said about people who offend children. We know how Jesus consistently acted towards the oppressed and the weak and the hurting. And Ben said that while he believes there's grace for repentant perpetrators, this guy isn't repentant. He's never said he's sorry. He's never taken any responsibility. He claims he never did it to me or my sisters. That was his words, which really made my investigators' eyes twitch, because when someone says they didn't do it to you or your sisters, you know they've done it to more than you. So when Ben said to my dad that he believes grace is there for repentant perpetrators, my dad butted in and was like, well, that same grace is still available to you at the wedding too. I began weeping when he said that, because again, it's this thing of not being willing to feel for other people. There's no empathy there for victims of abuse. He told me that my perception of feeling like people don't have my back is not reality. So again, gaslighting. I kept saying, well, then prove to me that you do. Prove to me that you have my back. Show me. At the end, he told me he would pray about it. So again, a very abusive conversation. To this day, he still works with my rapist. I have chosen to simply not go into much detail with my family about things, because I feel like it's not safe for me to do so. And so it's just something we don't talk about. We literally don't talk about it. And right now, at this point, I'm okay with that, simply because every time we have a conversation about it, it becomes a bunch of word salad and gaslighting and emotional abuse that is just not worth it for me to even go there. We've been very open to our kids about why we don't go back to grandma and grandpa's. My kids know. And yeah, it's hard. Sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own family. I feel like they're strangers to me in some ways. We don't do a lot of talking. I do sometimes. We have phone calls like every 2 weeks with my sisters. We have a sister's phone call, but it's never anything, deep. It's very like superficial and surface level conversation. So yeah, that's the extent of kind of my familial silencing.
What what does grace mean to them if someone has not even acknowledged that they did anything wrong? Like it's just move on, pretend nothing happened. Is that it?
Yeah.
Is that the extent of it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Forgiveness to them and grace is basically me just shutting up about it. Like, that's the short answer.
And so and when there are attitudes like this that you shared, and also in your previous church, the concern is like safety, like for children now, for anyone in the church who comes forward with an abuse story, any ongoing cases of abuse, uh, it doesn't sound like there's safety at all, or there's going to be any support of victims other than an initial, well, I believe you, but nothing more than that.
No, and like, I can't say much because there are abuse cases right now as we speak that are not my story to tell. But I will say that all of my gut instincts and feelings about church being safe or unsafe, I should say, those were legit feelings. Some of the same people who told me to be quiet and shut up, I'm saying that in quotations, but like told me to be a mom, to be a mom and a wife, were one of those people is a perpetrator. That just came out recently. So again, when there's pushback, I'm always like, okay, when you push back enough, I'm always like, what did you do? What are you covering up? What happened to you? Because there's a reason you are responding that way.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, it's just like unhealed trauma flying off the wall everywhere, right? In these conversations, you're like, that's just what I hear you saying, right? It's like, well, what's happening for you and what's going on in your world? Or, you know, I think about what your dad said about like Jesus in the crowd. I mean, so there, I mean, there's so many things there, but just one of the things that comes to my mind is like, who gets to be in that crowd, right? Like, not you, not the kids, not the victims, but the power. The people in power get to stand in the crowd, right? And that's who makes up these crowds of people that are welcome at the table, is if you have influence and power at some level. And so this kind of be a mom is like in this culture, moms don't have the power that even a dad does. And so when they say be a mom, they're saying find your place on the power wheel and make sure you don't step outside of that. They're not asking you to be a grizzly bear mom because that would be a very different kind of mom, right? And the kind I suspect that you are, right?
Yeah, 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 exactly. They're not, it was all about silencing. Like, that whole line was about silencing. And I recognize that now. I didn't recognize it then, but I recognize it now.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much that we can learn from and take away from these, like the experiences, the exact words that they're using that they weaponize, because it's like a playbook.
Oh, it
That's-
is.
And so there's so many lessons to take away from what you're sharing on. The general theme that we're looking at is like this picture of a good shepherd who keeps the sheep safe in a fold and fights away the wolves and the bears and the predators that come. And that's Jesus's picture, not ours. And yet this is completely absent in your story. It's more of a safe nest for predators to continue and getting away with it, and then telling victims you have to be here and you have to accept the terms of the safety or lack of it, that they're the environment that they've created. And it's just, when you share this, I just feel like it's so impactful for people who are going to listen and take note of how it works out in these communities specifically.
I hope it's impactful because, like, I want the Anabaptist Church to be safe for people like me. I hate that it's not fair to people to have to leave everything they knew and know just simply to be safe. And that's literally why we left. And so, and while I wouldn't want to go back, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that, like, I don't want other people to have to go through the same kind of stuff that we went through. So, do you want me to talk about leaving? Because that's my next section here.
Sure.
on my like 10 pages of notes that I have. So following the Sermon on Grace, those next 3 years were literal hell on earth. And it was terrible because I was trying to make it work. Everything in my gut was saying I'm not safe, but I really wanted to be safe because, again, this is all I know. I don't know anything outside of Mennonite culture. I have no friends outside of Mennonite culture. My entire world is Mennonite culture. That's all I know. And so COVID happened, and with it, a break from church. And I began to realize that church service in particular, was really, really making life hard for me. My brain could not handle it. Going to church felt like being stabbed in the heart every Sunday, because I literally couldn't hear anything a preacher said without it going through the lens of this grace thing that I'd heard 3 years ago, or that I heard in that sermon. And so I began professional therapy, which was the best thing I could have done for myself. I still go to therapy every 2 weeks. We've literally spent thousands of dollars on it, and it has been worth every penny. But COVID gave me a break, and I began to heal just a little bit, and I realized that church was really hurting me. Then we had to go back to church again, and for about 7 or 8 months, I just tried to make it work. But one Sunday in December of 2021, I stood in front of the mirror combing my hair to go to church, and I began crying. I looked in the mirror and my eyes freaked me out. I saw terror when I looked into my eyes, and I began crying, and I didn't stop until church service was half over. By that point, we were just like, well, let's just stay home. So we all stayed home, but that Sunday we decided that, you know what? It's time for me to take a break. I need a break from church. So for the next 5 months, I stayed home from church, and Ben took the kids to church by himself. I don't know if that was the right thing to do, because my kids didn't like that I stayed home from church. It was really a really rough time for all of us. But for me, being able to stay home from church was really good. I could cry, I could rest, I could just be. And my relationship with God was strengthened during that time, just simply because I would open the Bible and just read it on those Sundays. And I could grieve, I could cry. It was lovely. But I remember crying. I remember balling up on the couch and knowing that just down the road 1 mile, a whole church full of people are singing praises to God while I'm sitting there curled up in a ball weeping. And everything inside of me really broke, because I wanted them to see me. I wanted to be seen. I wanted my pain to be seen. I wanted somebody to weep with me. I wanted to be understood. I wanted to belong. And I felt completely and totally alone. It was a really hard time for me. After about 5 months of that, we decided to just go to church again as a family. the children were asking where mom is, and it was really rough for Ben trying to keep them all in church by himself. I mean, my kids were, I'm trying to think how old they were then. 6, 5, and 2, maybe. So it was rough. It was a rough time. On top of all the trauma with church services, I realized something else. I kind of accidentally stumbled upon the realization that I've been lied to about modesty protecting you. One night I went with Ben on the truck and I wore pants, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I ended up going into a place of business, and it was late at night. There were only men in there, and I walked in there and no one even looked at me. And I went, what? Because when you're in a dress and you're walking through a store, everyone looks. You look different. As a Mennonite woman, you look very different from everybody else. And so I was shocked. I came back to the truck and I was like, no one even looked at me. I was invisible. Like, I like that. So I began to wear pants to town because I felt safer in pants. I felt like no one looked, no one saw me, and that felt safe. That felt good. And so, you know, all my life I've been told that cape dresses hide your body and make you invisible, but I was finding it completely the opposite. And so it was the last straw for me was when I mentioned this to my support group. I mentioned to them that, you know, I felt safer in pants. I explained why. And I also told them, like, I know that in the church I grew up in, if I would wear pants, I would be basically excommunicated from church. Like, I knew that growing up. And I was like, you know, I really, really wish that there was a way for me to be able to wear pants while I'm at this church, just for a couple of years, even until I feel safe again in dresses. Because I knew at that point that sometimes triggers, like once you work through them, they kind of go away. And so I was hoping, in my brain, I was hoping that if they could give me some grace, there's that word again, if they could give me some grace and let me wear pants for a while, that possibly I could wear dresses again at some point and it not be so triggering. And so I told them my whole piece, and I paused, and 2 of them looked at me and said, but you promised to follow brotherhood agreements when you became members here. And I knew immediately that, again, there's nothing I can do about it. They're not willing to even make one exception for me. And so it was that day whenever I knew that it was either me choosing safety or me choosing to die. Like, that's literally what it boiled down to. And that was also the same day that Ben looked over at me and said, I'm dying here at Cornerstone. And I said, okay, we need to leave. And we made the choice that day to leave. Leaving is weird in that you kind of learn who your true friends are. You learn who really has your back and who doesn't. We've experienced a lot of, it's funny how things happen, or what people say when you leave. There were some people who were really surprised. There were other people who weren't surprised at all. There were other people who genuinely, it felt like they were very happy to see us leave. Like, they didn't want us around. It was very weird and telling, some of the reactions that we got. We tried really hard to not let our pain get in the way of our kids, because our kids had really good relationships with other kids there at church. And so we didn't want our pain to get in the way of our kids. And so when birthdays came around, we still invited our friends, their friends, over for parties. But I was not prepared for my daughter's birthday party when she turned 7. We invited friends, and 2 of the families refused to let their children, their little girls, come to her birthday party. It resulted in a lot of tears for our 7-year-old. We became a threat, but especially me. The reason that they didn't let their kids come was because of my posts. That's what they said. My posts. Specifically because my posts about abuse and my posts about modesty. Because by that point, my view on modesty had changed quite a lot. And so that was a threat to them. I've also been told that I'm a threat because of my tank tops and shorts and because of the music I listen to. Meanwhile, they're okay with somebody who sexually abused kids in their church. And so again, when I say that I didn't feel safe at church, their actions after we left are proving to me that my gut was exactly right, that they really were not safe, that they really do not get and understand abuse and how it works. Again, that story is not mine to tell, so I'm not going into detail, but this thing of being coined as being dangerous while they're okay with hanging out with an actual abuse offender, it makes me more angry than I can describe. It feels so incredibly wrong. So there's that. Also, interestingly enough, I've been hit on by more Mennonite men before or since leaving than before leaving, which is very weird. And again, I think kind of cements the fact that lust has nothing to do with what one wears. But I just find it very, very odd. It's like, I don't know why that is. Maybe somebody else can like speak to like why that is. I'm not alone in that. I know that there are other people who leave who've had that experience too, and it's just very weird. But yeah, you find out who your friends are when you leave.
I have a question about the way you said people look at you when you were still, was that Peachey?
Yes.
So when you go out in public, for example, what do you experience when people stare and look at you
As a Mennonite woman?
Yeah, as a Peachey woman.
Okay. So I often felt like people were undressing me with their eyes. And I felt like a mouse in the middle of a bunch of cats. I felt very unsafe. I don't know if some of it was curiosity on the part of other people or if there was, actual lust and bad intentions. I don't know. Probably a lot of both. But it made me feel very unsafe. Like I couldn't hide. I couldn't just do my shopping. I felt like I always had to watch my back. And that has changed a lot since I'm not Mennonite.
I've had friends who are in a podcast talking about sort of fetishization, and literally there was a girl who left the Amish, and when her coworkers found out, they're like, "Oh, can you act out this fantasy with me? Can you?"
Yeah.
Like I think your gut feeling as a survivor, knowing what an unsafe environment is, like that probably like it sounds spot on from what other people have experienced as well.
Yeah.
That gut feeling of being objectified, that you're now this object of people's fantasy and of curiosity, and like it's so dangerous, and I'm so glad you're out of that.
Yeah. So actually, I'll speak to that a little bit more by saying that my husband says that there's this thing of, men who aren't Mennonite tend to sexualize Mennonite women.
Mm-hmm.
But then Mennonite men tend to sexualize women who are not Mennonite. And again, goes back for me to the whole thing of lust being something that does not come from outside sources, right? Mm-hmm. It comes from within you. And and it's not just for men. Lust isn't just a man problem, but you get the point. Like it's wanting what you cannot have, right? It's trying to get what you can't have. The whole thing of fetishizing Mennonite women, that's a huge thing. I definitely experienced that as a Mennonite woman.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your lived experience, because again, hopefully the more people share, the more people are being heard and believed.
I don't want to jump in and cut you off, and I'm just curious, in terms of your story with leaving, um, the work that you're doing now in terms of like that healing part of that, is that, I might be again getting ahead here. This is my brain. I'm ADHD, so I'm all over the place. Uh, you mentioned it, right? You're in therapy every week, and that's exciting to me, as someone who does this work. Yeah, just wondering, that might be coming in your notes, but I was just curious about that piece, if you were going to speak to that more in terms of what that healing has looked like for you.
Sure. So I have found a lot of healing with EMDR.
Love it.
I've done a lot of EMDR. And it's one of those things that I know it sounds funny to some people until you like kind of break it down for them, what that looks like, what that is. But I'm deeply grateful for professionals in a mental health field who've been able to help my brain desensitize some of that stuff, and basically take it from some of the subconscious part of my brain to the conscious part, so that we can actually work on it, and deal with it in a way that's like safe. The other thing that's really helped me is, I know this sounds funny, but I'm a really big proponent of walking, or of some kind of like exercise. Going to the gym has been hugely helpful to me, because I feel like it helps my brain process trauma, helps my body process trauma, because trauma is also stored in our bodies.
Huge.
So all of that stuff has really been a big blessing to me. And I am really, really grateful for all the healing that has happened. And I have a lot more to do, but I'm sure that's going to still, I mean, it's just a journey, it's not, I'm not healed yet. Like, it's a journey toward more wholeness. And I feel like there's a part of me, I feel like that's not going to be completely healed till, another time, another place. But I'm just grateful for the healing that is there, and for professionals that, can help steer me in the right direction.
That's awesome. And I mean, movement is unbelievable when it
Yeah.
comes to trauma, right? I mean, we talk about the body keeping the score, and the ways in which that intentional movement is like communicating something to your body, right? It's giving your body safety, and it's also giving your body control and power, right? If you're lifting or you're running or whatever, you're essentially retraining your body how to take back control of itself. And I think I've personal experience with that. So I just know how I feel after I do that kind of thing. And yeah, so I think that's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit about the culture's approach to grief and healing? Because you talk about that, the fact that you were grieving and alone. It reminds me of this book that came out by CLP that talked about a woman who was so depressed that she had blisters in her eyes from crying, and yet she just needed to repent and be less ungrateful and be more submissive. And she's thankful that she wasn't allowed to go for therapy, because now she figured out how, Jesus could fix it. And there's so much of that. Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about spiritual abuse in relation to not giving a space for grief and healing.
Yeah. I think that grief is not really allowed in that culture. I don't know what it's like. I don't know a lot about grief in terms of death. So I can't speak to that. But what I can tell you is that grief is not something that is welcomed. It's not embraced. And I feel like this is my journey. This is what I've learned, okay? But you cannot feel joy when you're not allowing yourself to feel pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so lament was one of the greatest pieces, I think, for me.
Mm-hmm.
I went through years of where I literally couldn't feel joy. All I felt was grief. And I came out the other side and I'm a much better person because of it. And I think that when we don't allow people to grieve, when we don't give them space, we don't give them time, when we just tell them all these, positive cliche thingies,
Mm-hmm.
when we throw Bible verses at them, that's just all this joy, happiness, blah, 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 blah. We are short-circuiting the ability for them to heal well. And so, especially in a story like mine, there's a lot of grief there. And I feel like I haven't fully grieved some parts of it yet. And so, excuse me, I feel like the greatest gift you can give people who are grieving is give them space, give them time, all the time they need. Because once you get to the point where you're done grieving, I don't know, I shouldn't say done grieving, that's not the right way to say it. But you kind of get to a point where it doesn't feel quite as big anymore. And there's joy that comes. And so, but you can't rush that. You can't rush that process. And when we rush people to just get better, we end up really hurting them in the long run. I think that's how we get so much denial, how we get so much a lack of empathy in our culture. That's one way, is because we short circuit the grieving process for people.
It's good. Mennonites are good Stoic Germans, right? And Swiss. And so there's a lot of that plays. I mean, I'm of course stereotyping an entire culture, but I mean, there is this level of deep stoicism that runs in our veins, right? And so there's this level of if you can just keep calm and carry on, and when the really hard things come, if we can find a way to pretend it didn't happen, just all over your story, or if we can find a way to somehow stifle the tears with working harder or doing something else, then we can get through it. And so the language that you're using of lament, of just sitting with stuff, our culture doesn't love that because it feels counterproductive, right? It feels like you're not doing anything. Like you can't just sit on the couch and cry because you could be cleaning or you could be doing something productive. And I think so you have all those factors at play, and then just a fear of feeling out of control, right? And feeling like you don't know what you're going to do. That feeling of just, I don't know if this is ever going to get better. I don't know if there's some sort of, Sunday school answer that after Johnny put the cookie back in the jar, he felt better. The classic stuff we read in Sunday school every time. It's like, well, sometimes it doesn't get better. And sometimes it's hell on earth for decades before anything really makes any sense for you. And so, yeah, it's the way you're describing that is 100%. It's the only way you can heal is if you sit in it, right?
It sounds like there's a lack of space for messiness, and there's a strong emphasis on looking put together and having control, at least over the house,
Yeah.
or the yard. And so the fact that you were allowed, you let yourself grieve and experience and process the trauma, and not necessarily be exactly on top of your house or whatever. It sounded like that was not people did not know what to do with that.
No, they didn't. They had no clue what to do with that. They had no clue what to do with somebody who was honest about what they were feeling. That's a really good segue into the whole spanking thing.
Mhm. So when I hear your story, and there's so much violence, right? Violence to your soul, sexual violence. Um, and people who follow me, who watched the last thing we did on Kingdom Outpost, we talked with Marissa and Kelsey all about the idea of corporal punishment, spanking within Christian contexts. And we know in the Mennonite community that's a big thing. And so and you and I have talked about it kind of just one-on-one about the ways in which this played out for you kind of parallel to the rape and to the sexual assault. And I think you used the word, it felt linked, does feel linked. And so just want to give you space for that conversation as well to say, how did that play out for you? As it's something that, you know, Rebecca and I have worked on and talk about as well. We'd love to hear more from your story.
Yeah. So, yeah, for me, there is absolutely a link. In EMDR, it comes up all the time. Interestingly enough, actually, which this is a whole nother conversation that we probably could go into more, but spanking, rape, and ordination come up a lot. And I think it's because of the whole power and violence thing. But spanking and rape, my body perceived both of those as trauma. I was primarily disciplined in the form of spanking, which a lot of Mennonite kids are. And I like to describe spanking because I feel like that's kind of a must. You have to kind of describe it. Everybody has it happen differently to them. Spankings for me included being taken out to the woodshed, being bent over my dad's lap or my mom, head close to the ground, butt in the air, and being spanked until you cried enough. Unfortunately, if I cried too much, I was threatened with another spanking. And so if I cried too little, I was spanked harder. So it was this very weird middle that you had to find as a kid for everything to stop. And I think I know everybody talks about spanking being done in love, so therefore it's not abuse. But for me, this thing of being told I'm spanking you because I love you, they were exactly the same words as what got used during the rape, that I'm doing this because I love you. And so for me, my body linked those two things together. I remember a few times I was hit in anger, but the twisted love messaging and emotional suppression did far more damage than the anger ever did. And I want Mennonite families to hear that, because I don't care if you're not spanking your kids in anger. If you are suppressing their cries, if you are doing it because you love them, that's a very twisted message that really messes up a kid's psyche. And it's really hard. I think I didn't just experience spanking, obviously I witnessed it too. And I also witnessed it being used, being done to my siblings. One particular incident is that I had a sibling who was spanked at least 10 times in a row, at least, for not wanting to put on the right kind of shirt for Wednesday evening Bible study. He was 4 or 5. I remember trying to hide my tears, praying, begging God to please, please, please make him do what they say, because I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle hearing the screams. I wanted to beg for mercy for him, but I knew that if I did, it would be my turn next. All over a shirt, all over what kind of a shirt to wear. Like, really? But my brain categorized rape and spanking in the same folder, I like to say. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but during EMDR, the rape and spanking were meshed together many, many times. And I think for me, the reason for that is because both included this twisted love message. I'm doing this because I love you. Both included having to stuff emotion in order to survive. Again, both included body degradation. It's very degrading to be hit on your butt. Both taught me that to love was to submit no matter what. Both taught me that I did not have control over myself. People bigger than me did. Both taught me I couldn't trust my instincts. Both taught me that my feelings didn't matter and my voice didn't matter. Both taught me that love was confusing and painful. And the thing that really people don't want to hear is that both included arousal as well, which felt like body betrayal to me. And I know that not everybody experiences that piece, and that's okay. But even if you take that piece away, the damage that it does whenever a kid is told that I'm doing this because I love you, whenever violence is linked with love, that is a very, very scary place to be. I'm reading a book right now. It's called, oh goodness, what is it called now? But it's something about emotional intelligence. And they link this thing of rapists and psychopaths, people that have no empathy, with this thing of being spanked as a kid, which I find super interesting, because I would, from my perspective of Mennonite culture, there's so little empathy for victims. And I really, really wonder if the link is not something to do with this thing of being beaten as kids until we can't, like, being beaten and spanked to the point of having to like suppress everything. And so because we can't feel our own emotions, we can't feel for other people. So just the thing of suppressing emotion alone is enough to really mess up a child and make it hard to regulate as an adult. And for that reason, Ben and I quit spanking our kids a couple of years ago, and I regret every single time that I did it to my kids before that. I'm not ashamed to say it. I regret it. I hate it. I hate that I went against my gut and spanked my kids because my gut said it wasn't safe to do so. So yeah, spanking is a pretty big deal for me in regards to that, because I feel like, again, take the arousal part out, it's still terrible on a kid, even when you're doing it in love, even when, especially whenever you're praying with them. I know parents sometimes pray with their kids before they do that. Oh, for heaven's sake, please don't do that. Like, that you're linking God with violence. And a kid can't distinguish what you're doing other than it's violence. Their brain takes it as violence. So yeah, I'm pretty new to the whole speaking out against spanking thing, but I feel like that my story definitely lends itself in that direction, and that's one reason why it came out where I did on it.
I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, it's interesting you say you're new to it. It feels also like this is a new frontier in some of these spaces, right? You talked about 2016 when you're writing, that a lot of people are talking about abuse in your cultures and that kind of thing. This topic in Christianity as a whole, and conservative Christianity, is relatively new too, that people are saying this is a big problem and we have a real problem on our hands. And as somebody with lived experience in this and story as well, it wasn't until just a couple years ago that really anybody beyond, like, there's some old works back in the 90s from like Alice Miller and like Philip Grevin's book on Spare the Child. There's a few, right, that are dusty old copies that the kind of quote liberals of that time were saying, but really not many people were saying anything. But now I think millennials, who are, I don't know what we are, touchy-feely, whatever. And we're going out there and we're saying, hey, like, we've got some stuff going on. And
Mhm.
so I think it is good to talk about it in the context of your whole story, because the way you just linked it to both kind of the sexual assault, but then also to the empathy piece is really, really important. Because I agree with you, from what I've seen in my work, from what I've seen kind of personally and lived stories with friends of mine who I know experienced pretty traumatic spanking, and then the ways in which it impacted their I think, empathetic responses. Even
Mhm.
when I witnessed like bullying and stuff at school, and the kids who were super aggressive and knowing what their home lives were like. So I'm saying a lot of things at once, but I think that that is a big deal, a really big deal. And so I'm grateful for you sharing that piece of your story as well. Rebecca, I don't know if you have anything you wanted
It,
to add to that.
it's interesting when this subject comes up that people shut down their I'm fine. They somehow have to always go to the fact that they have to proclaim that they are fine, even if other people, like I did a poll and maybe 80% of people experience either frequent or occasional punishment that went, in their opinion, quote unquote, too far. And yet they're still, but it's loving, it can be a good thing, it can be nurturing, it can, like, somehow, like you say, there's a shutting down of empathy, there's a part where they don't want to go there. And that, in my mind, I also connect it to when people share things from uh conservative Christian nationalist sources that are like, too many people are going to therapy and the world is so self-indulgent and weak now. You just need to toughen up. And I think that these things are also connected in your story, and you really shed light on when, and now it makes me think when people say things like that like, oh, therapy is just for people who are self-indulgent and weak, it makes me think that they have things that they're stuffing down and not dealing with and silencing, and difficult, messy things that have to be locked up and turned off and just shut away.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Like, whenever somebody just completely shuts down when I tell my story, or when I'm, honest. There were many times whenever they would want me to, at church, they would want me to be more vulnerable. But when I was, people would shut down. And I really do believe that a lot of that is due to somebody's personal story. Um, we don't like pain, and we're not always ready to, deal with things either. So I get that. I don't want people to think that I'm bashing people over the head for,
No.
not wanting to deal with stuff. Sometimes we're not ready for it. Like, our bodies aren't ready for it. And that's understandable. But yeah, as somebody who like watches people's reactions, 100%, there's people who have a story who have not ever felt safe to share it. They don't even realize that it's there.
And so it's actually this kind of call to seriously grapple with all the questions that you've raised is an invitation. And it's an invitation to everyone, even those who have realized, oh, I've done something harmful. I've tried to silence a victim. I tried to do that in the past. It's like a really redemptive thing of like, let's sit down and grapple with some of these hard questions. And it's an open invitation, literally, to everyone and anyone who wants to enter that conversation.
That's good. And the word that, like, it's so overused in therapy, but we use the word curiosity, right? Like, let's be curious about that. But it's overused, and yet it's not, because that is in my heart, like, that's the posture, right? If our posture is curiosity. So if someone comes forward and says, "Hey, this is my story," and even if you're in a space where something about it feels off, or like you said, Anne, you have this unhealed trauma that blocks your ability to empathize with that person. If someone can turn with curiosity towards a story, that is a postured invitation and safety to say, "That's really interesting. I don't understand anything about that. I've never heard of that before, but I'm curious. What does that mean for you? What is like, tell me more about your story." Is such a different posture than, "Well, that can't be right." Right? Like, I've experienced that so often in the whole conversation about spanking and sexual arousal. People are just blown away by that. Like, I've never heard of that. That can't be a thing. Um, just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not a thing. So where's the curiosity, right? And that's always what I'm just inviting people to. I'm not asking you to believe everything I believe, or even think certain things about therapeutic modalities that I believe. I'm a big fan of IFS, and if you hate that, internal family systems, as a way to, process trauma, cool. Use a different one. But just a way to say, like, I hold space for you. hold space for your story and where you're coming from. And I believe, that you have a story. And so let's share together,
Yeah, and along with that curiosity, like be curious about your own response to
Yeah, that's
somebody's
good.
story.
Mm-hmm.
Be curious whenever you want to run, whenever you want to shut your ears. Like just be curious about that. And I try to be curious about my own responses too, because I have those as well.
We all do.
Yeah, we do.
Well,
Rebecca,
thank
how
you
do you want to
so
land the plan? There you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story
Mm.
and trusting us with it. The Kingdom Outpost has largely Anabaptist and ex-Anabaptist audience, so it's like I really hope that more people listen. I would definitely be sharing it with people who are in the kind of communities that you describe or the kind of areas that you describe. And I really hope that we hope to have more, I think, survivor stories, because the churches are never going to become a safer place until we start listening to where things go wrong. It's not just let's start right here right now, we can agree that that one thing was bad and we'll just pretend that everything is good otherwise. There has to be grappling, because who knows what girl is going through what you're going through, or boy, sitting in church, looking right, having to say the right things, getting baptized, following, and I'm so grateful you've shared it and you've prepared so much and put so much, it's not just what you wrote in response to the questions, it's also the years of work that you've put into yourself and to tell the story. So thank you so much.
Hey, it was a pleasure. It was fun.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.